welcome again, everybody. Thank you for taking some time this afternoon to do this. This is the first. We'll see how this goes. Tammy, it's lovely to see you this afternoon.
Good to see you too, Steve. I'm excited to talk about this very relevant topic. I just attended another discussion an hour ago about monuments. So one thing I will say is this, to just with broad strokes, to think about the historical context. You know, this is not the first time in history that activists, especially African Americans, have questioned our celebration of Confederate monuments, and of course, questioned the existence of the Confederate flag throughout the United States, including state capitals. But as we know, unfortunately, with the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, an unarmed Black man, and given the details of that murder and the fact that it was caught on tape, and it was just so horrific and gruesome as that police officer knelt on his neck, I think this was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a wake-up call to all Americans. Most African Americans were well aware of racism in this country, but I think this is the most woke, to use a slang term, I have ever seen non-Black people in this country. Let me give you an example. My sister lives in Houston, Texas, and George Floyd was from Houston, Texas. We as a family have connections to the cities that are relevant for this issue, because my sister and I both lived in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and we worked in St. Paul. And so my sister attended the processional to the cemetery after George Floyd's funeral in Houston, Texas. And she said when she arrived, she showed up quite early, and she was the only African-American person that she could see. She said, there were white Houstonians, Latino Houstonians. You know, these are all folks who are living in Houston, Asian, South Asian. And she said it was really good to see. So this question of monuments and this question of our contested history is a living and breathing thing. So I'm wondering if you could respond to that, yeah, Steve, to talk about this historical moment.
Yeah, so I agree with what you just said, Tammy, and I myself, I guess I'm getting to be old enough to have some memories to have comparisons to, but I agree, this feels to me like a very different moment than moments past. It's not as if these events haven't happened in the past, but they just haven't seemed to resonate nationally the way these have. I might push this back a couple of years, however, especially when we connect this to symbols of the Confederacy. I think I would go back to 2015 to Dylann Roof and the massacre at the AME church in Charleston, South Carolina. Some of you all were in high school or junior high, perhaps, when that event happened. One of the things, of course, that came out was that all across Dylann Roof's social media feeds and whatnot, there he was waving Confederate flags, and he linked his own murderous activities against these, I guess 8 or 9 Black parishioners in Charleston to the waving of the Confederate flag. And it was at that moment in South Carolina, at any rate, that they finally decided to take down the Confederate flag off of the state capitol, where it had been, not actually for a very long time, which is itself interesting. But I agree. I think sort of starting with that, and then George Floyd more recently, I think over the last 5 years, there really has been a shift now in reassessing what I think for a lot of people just has been kind of wallpaper. Like, oh yeah, Dixie Drive, General Lee, Confederate flags, NASCAR. I think all of a sudden people are asking questions about that weren't being asked even that long ago.
To think about the Confederate flag and these monuments as wallpaper, I must underscore a couple of sources that I start with in some of my intro classes. One source I start with is called What is History by British historian Edward Carr. Yep. And he says, facts are not pure, they're refracted through the mind of the historian. So the facts that the historian chooses to tell in and of itself is based on that historian's perspective. So let's think about monuments and what this means about our national identity and the stories we choose to tell.
Yep.
So if we choose to tell and erect these huge statues of Confederate, militiamen, but we don't tell the stories of, let's say, even African Americans who contributed to the war effort for freedom, then there's so much that's lost. I also in my intro level classes talk about a story by the Marleys. So these are Bob Marley's children, Ziggy, Steve Marley, etc. There's a song that says, "There are many stories, both old and new. What is true?" And they give the classic quote about the idea of Christopher Columbus allegedly discovering America, but how can you discover a country where people already live, Native Americans here, right? And they use that example to say, there are many stories, both old and new, what is true. So I'll say this, and keep in mind, I come from a family that's particularly conscious. I credit my mother with creating and shaping my own love for history, especially African American history. So I'll say for me, and especially for my family, these monuments have not been background on wallpaper. They've been something we've been mindful of. So it all depends on perspective, point of view.
Oh, yeah.
One more personal example, for around 3 years in a row, my family, my generation, my cousins, we took a family trip to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and we'd stay in a chalet. I would just chill at the chalet. I would never go into town because I wanted to relax. But even my then 12-year-old and then 10-year-old nephews told me that when they went into town, they were tired of seeing Confederate flags and they were tired of being the only Black people there. So, this is a living, breathing history that's still relevant.
Sure.
And it's all about perspective, right? We're seeing this from very different perspectives.
I'm going to say the golden age of these monument, when they were put up, was, let's say, from the 1890s through the 1920s. That's when I think the vast bulk of them went up. The purpose of this was precisely to normalize the Confederacy. What those monuments were intended to do was to counter what people in the 1860s and 1870s, Northerners, perfectly well understood about the Confederacy. What you're seeing here is from a New York State newspaper from the end of the Civil War, April 10th, 1865. And what you're noticing in this, and there are dozens of these, you can find these in newspapers all across the North in 1865, slavery and treason buried in the same grave. The Confederates were understood at the time to be traitors and to have engaged in treason against the United States. General Lee and Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, had their citizenship stripped after the Civil War. They were no longer allowed to be citizens of the United States. And that was the compromise, because plenty of people in Washington wanted them executed for treason. So what Southerners needed to do was, in a sense, to erase this aspect of the Civil War, to somehow to get everybody to believe that the Confederacy was a noble cause, a lost cause perhaps, but something where there was honor and justice in having fought for it. And the first task here was to persuade the rest of the country that this wasn't an act of treason, though people at the time fully understood that. So those monuments, as they get erected in the 1890s and the 1910s and around the First World War, are designed to do that. Yeah, and so here's Senator Andrew Johnson, who would become President Johnson. I will show you a traitor. This is, again, common language that's being used at the time. The rewriting of history from a Southern point of view eliminates this side of the story. Here's Henry Adams saying that General Lee should have been hung. Well, hanged is the word he uses. Henry Adams is the grandson of John Quincy Adams, the great grandson of John Adams. He is, steeped in that American political tradition. He was a diplomat in London during the Civil War. So again, that's that's the first act of rewriting the history of the Civil War, is to eliminate this aspect of treason and traitors, and the way this gets done publicly is through those monuments. One of the things that's remarkable, I've said this to some of my students in the past, is that we are accustomed to thinking that history gets written by the winners. In the case of the history of the Civil War, it got written by the losers. The writing of Southern history was dominated by Southern apologists, arguably until the Second World War. There were some exceptions to this, notably W.E.B. Du Bois. But by and large, the historians who wrote about this to engage in Southern apologetics. And a lot of Northerners just didn't care much one way or the other. And it really wasn't until the post-Second World War period that we really began to dig into this history more and to begin to recover what this war and its legacy were really, really all about. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think that's very important. That is super important historical context. And to just break it down for any students who are present, anything that exists for a reason, right? What is this monument here for? What is it here to do? And as you just eloquently stated, it was a part of this very deliberate attempt by Southerners to change this narrative of failure and of being, in a sense, traitors and non-Americans. I think that's really important. I'm wondering if you could follow that up by fast forwarding a bit in history to think about Confederate symbols as resistance during the Civil Rights Movement, the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm gonna backdate you just a little bit on this. So when historians have poked around on this, Confederate flags, the stars and the bars, are very rare. Nobody sees them. They're not displayed publicly in the 20th century until 1948. And that's when they come out again. And they come out again specifically in connection to the campaign of breakaway Democrats running for president. And this is Strom Thurmond, who was the so-called Dixiecrats, who ran in defense of segregation. And they brought out so the story is that in 1948, the Democratic Party, as it's hammering out its national platform, includes a commitment to civil rights for the very first time. Southern Democrats are so furious at this that they walk out of the convention, and a number of them form a third political party. They run Strom Thurmond, who is at the time governor of South Carolina. He becomes senator, and then he becomes senator for about 400 years after that. He runs as president on what was called the States' Rights Party, and it was purely in defense of Southern segregation. That's when the flags come out again. So when you look at some of those iconic photographs from the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and you look not so much at the marchers, but at the angry crowds around the marchers, you will invariably see Confederate flags. It became the symbol, the quickest shorthand to signify your opposition to any attempts at eliminating racial segregation across the South. And so again, starts in 48. You see it all through the 1950s, all through the 1960s, and entirely is as opposition to the civil rights movement. Interestingly as well, the Confederate flag as part of state flags, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, dates to this moment as well. It's not part of some long tradition. Those flags were redesigned. In Georgia, I think it was redesigned as late as about 1962 to include the Confederate flag as a symbol of the opposition this state had, at least white folks in that state had, to civil rights. So it's the connection here when we look at all this stuff is really easy to draw. Confederate flags are the symbol of opposition to civil rights.
Let me ask you another question. I'm thinking of symbols of the Confederacy and location. So I listened to a very interesting NPR discussion today on National Public Radio about the Confederate flag and or Confederacy monuments outside of courthouses throughout the United States. So let's talk specifically about that and why might the existence of a monument or flag that celebrates the Confederacy be problematic, specifically in front of a courthouse?
I think that's a really important point because virtually every one of those county courthouses in every county seat would have a Civil War monument here. And in some ways, it's a reminder, it's a not so subtle reminder of the color of justice that you can anticipate inside this court. Now, again, we know historians have done, I haven't, but other colleagues of ours have done incredible work documenting the relationship between African Americans and the criminal justice system and the justice system altogether. So connecting what goes on inside this courtroom with the mythology of the Confederacy, as I said, is a not so subtle reminder of who really is in charge of justice. Justice is not blind in that case. And I think, I won't speak to what goes on inside those courthouses today, but nonetheless, the fact that some of these monuments and symbols still stand, I find problematic, and I think it's probably time to ask some hard questions about them. And just to kind of underscore the connection here between the Confederacy and segregation, this is in some ways, I think, the most interesting or the most telling of these Confederate monuments. I'm going to show you, this is, again, it's a classic, it's the double equestrian statue of Robert Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Okay, the variation that these were put up all over the place. The location of this one, however, is Baltimore, Maryland, and it was unveiled in 1948. Well, here we are, right? Now, what's fascinating, of course, is that while Maryland was a slave state, it was not part of the Confederacy. It did not join the Confederacy. So it's worth asking, why on earth is there a monument to the Confederacy in Baltimore, Maryland, except as opposition, again, to the emerging civil rights revolution that's coming in the wake of the Second World War and so forth?
I'm happy you mentioned that date, 1948, because that it prompted my memory to put all of this not only in national context, but also in international context. So 1948 was the same year that apartheid was instituted in South Africa. So as the world really was moving towards, let's say in the United States, the civil rights movement was gaining traction. We were moving towards equality in terms of eventually desegregating schools and other public spaces. And as the colonies, let's say in the Caribbean and most of the continent of Africa, were moving closer towards their own liberation struggles against European colonizers, South Africa, on the other hand, the Nationalist Party, which was ruled by the white minority, was becoming deeply entrenched. And so this battle over monuments is not only happening in the United States, it's happening around the world.
Yeah.
And there is a brilliant TED Talk by a Black woman performance artist in South Africa who stood and embodied this mythical figure combined with her Xhosa Black African ancestry roots. As the Cecil Rhodes statue went down in a public space, right, she stood there as this opposing, narrative to say, as this monument is coming down, there's literally a crane lifting it. She, as this Black woman, was representing Black African history. We know Black South Africans are not a monolith. There are over 11 different languages, ethnic groups spoken in South Africa, but still, she was standing in as this opposing narrative to say, as this white colonial figure, Cecil Rhodes, is being dethroned, look, as a Black woman, I'm representing the people of my country.
I think that's a really interesting point. that there is an international dimension to this. And I think, you know, when I look at this, the South was viewed by the rest of the country as somehow this self-contained, almost isolated part of the country. You know, my mom talks about taking one family vacation down to Florida in the 1950s. It was their big trip. And they really felt like they were going, like they needed passports. They were going into some foreign country from New York. But historians, I think, have really done a terrific job recently of exploring the international dimensions, the way in which Southern segregation became a model in South Africa. A book that came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago, looking at the relationship between Southern segregation and Hitler's Germany in framing some of the laws there. So this is not just a local story. It really isn't. It has international dimensions across Africa, as you mentioned, across the Caribbean, and even in other parts of Europe as well.
Right.
So should we pop over to some questions?
Yes, yes, let's do that.
So I think everybody can see the comment here about love and honor. And Tammy, I don't have the faintest idea where this comes from. Amy Shaman's answer here is quite interesting. I have no idea whether there is a connection here between the children of the Confederacy and Miami's motto. That's really interesting.
That is quite compelling, and I'm wondering if
Yeah.
Amy might be willing to comment on this. I can say quickly, I was in on a recent town hall meeting that took place over the late summer months before we resumed classes, and we know that students at Miami University are also demanding more justice, diversity, inclusion. And there was a letter written by students of color that the administration received over the summer. It was after the George Floyd murder, and it was combined with the case of the emeritus professor in education, Doug Brooks, who said racist slurs against Black Lives Matter protesters in Oxford, Ohio. And these students of color believe that the university did not respond in a, just dignified way, in an adequate way. They were disappointed with the university response, saying it didn't happen on university property, it's freedom of speech, et cetera. And so the students who wrote that letter just eloquently and rightfully focused on the concept of love and honor. And they said, as students of color at Miami, they do not feel loved, nor do they feel honored. And in this town hall meeting that I participated in over the summer, there's a very smart faculty member, I literally wrote in the chat, who asked that question? It's brilliant, and no one responded. But someone asked the workshop facilitators about this connection to the Civil War and Confederacy, but I don't know that history in particular. But Amy, do you mind commenting?
Hi, Tammy. So I didn't say it publicly because I didn't share. I was moderating that behind the scenes, and it was Dana who said it, who posted it here. And that comment struck me and started some conversations that Dana and I have been having, as well as doing a little bit of research. So one of the places we know where the phrase love and honor is in our university body is in the fight song. So I reached out to the archives, and Dr. Johnson at the archives was kind enough to go in and pull for me a document that Raymond Burke wrote about his process of writing the fight song, the alma mater, and one other song that has a racist name I don't even want to say, has to do with when the university used to do something very anti-Native American during football games. At any rate, there is a long discussion. It's about 6 pages typed, I think, and Dana saw it too, so Dana, please jump in, about the origins of the music, but unfortunately there's not a word in that document about the origin of the lyrics. So there's a deeper dive that we need to do, and I just have not done it yet. But I'm very interested in anything that you're aware of. What Dana said caused me to do some other simple Google searching, and I found the Children of the Confederacy piece. There was a plaque in the Texas State House up until, I believe, 2 years ago, that talked about the Children of the Confederacy, that a member of the Texas House asked to be pulled down, and there was some agreement to it. But apparently this use of love and honor with a reference to the Confederacy, Raymond Burke, I believe, wrote the fight song in 1909-ish. So, you know, it kind of is interesting in terms of the timeline you all are speaking of, in terms of when people start to rewrite the Confederacy. So maybe there's some interesting notes there that might help us. But if you have any suggestions of where to dig, I'm interested in that, and happy to take this offline too. But, that is kind of where I was coming from on this. But
So
it comes from Dana. Thank you, Dana.
Yeah, this is Dana here. I just wanted to just say one thing. Yeah, I made that comment back at that town hall, and I moved to Miami, or started working in Miami in 2012, and I think that's about the time that that term came out and all the kind of marketing around it. My understanding was it actually kind of was modeled on a creed that came from Auburn University. And just for personal reasons, it always just felt wrong to me. And so just doing some more research, I was just trying to follow that personal thread if it felt wrong to other people. And I do know there has been some surveys on that term, and it's very polarizing from the communications office. Either people really love it or really hate it.
I want to share my screen now. I have about 3 slides I want to share, and then I'm hoping to segue into the next question, which is reimagining monuments, even talking about love and honor, and perhaps a mantra that could replace that, because as Dana said, something about it never felt right to me. And I'll be honest with you, I saw that sign off actually used by some new representatives of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Miami. And it made me cringe a bit, because I thought, aren't they aware of this letter that the students wrote saying students of color at Miami do not feel loved, nor do they feel honored? You know, it's layered, it's complex, but it starts here with the discussion, right? So I'm gonna share my screen here. And we're gonna think about these images. All right. So let's think about America's monuments reimagined. We talked about this a moment ago, flags. So look at the flag, which I did some quick research. Anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but this one featuring the Confederate, symbol there for Mississippi, it was first hoisted in 1861, but now they've reimagined it in 2020 as such. And once again, I cannot underscore the fact that activists have been pushing for changes, including changing this flag for, really over a century.
Right.
But it's gaining traction and momentum, unfortunately, because of the loss of George Floyd's life. And it's the tipping point, right? The tipping point. Okay, let's talk about the possibility of reimagining monuments. And this is something I've seen online recently, projections onto Confederate monuments. And this one is in Richmond, Virginia. It's a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And as you can see, it says, "No America without Black America," and BLM, Black Lives Matter. And since I teach African American history and I teach American history, and my first job when I finished undergrad was actually working at a history museum, the Minnesota Historical Society. Even as a 20-something-year-old, I said, okay, African American history is American history. So why is it that we just have Black History Month in February? We do all these special programs, but I think we should do programs throughout the whole year. They listened to me and they listened, kind of smiled, but didn't really follow my advice, because, museums are often, like other institutions, stuck into set patterns to say, well, this is what the public expects. But still, I would always try to push back and say, look, American history is also Asian American history. It's Native American history. It's not just white American history. And that's the crux of this issue. We know, unfortunately, Breonna Taylor, that's the image that you have at the bottom of your screen, the woman in Louisville, Kentucky, who was shot and killed in her own apartment while sleeping. And a lot of activists are disappointed with the lack of justice in terms of bringing the officers to justice. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and let's talk about how can we reimagine some of these monuments? Should these monuments be taken down? And Steve, do you want to specifically talk about the controversy about the George Washington Monument on campus for anyone who doesn't know about that?
Well, so yeah, let me get to that because you've just raised a really big and I think really interesting question about, okay, so what do we do with them? And I do want to say that we are not the first generation to experience this. If we go back to the 1770s, there was a big equestrian statue of George III in Manhattan. And people pulled that down and they melted it down and they turned it into cannonballs or something like that. Because this, in some ways, it's the symbolic act against the symbol of the thing which is now no longer acceptable. One of the things that happened, and I wish that my colleagues, we in my department, we have nothing but Steves, and so he's known as Steve 1. But Steve Norris, who does Russian history and Soviet history, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet Union and those countries of Eastern Europe were littered with statues of reviled figures, Lenin, Dzerzhinsky, Stalin. And they came down. They came down dramatically, people, and in some instances outside of Moscow, outside of Budapest, they were dragged off and they created these almost bizarre kind of sculpture gardens. They become places of the fallen monuments. And so people go and they walk on top of them or they bring a picnic or something like that. That's another way of handling this. You can throw these statues in the river. You can put them in a new location, which gives them a different valence, a different meaning. You can fight to keep them up, which is certainly what we've seen recently in some places, largely unsuccessfully. I think for me, the decisions that you make have a lot to do with what the community that has to interact with these symbols on a weekly basis decide needs to be done about them. So you mentioned what our colleagues over in the architecture school in Alumni Hall, and in the middle of this rotunda stands a larger than life-size statue of George Washington. And people in the architecture school starting this semester want to ask some questions about what it's doing there and what else could be there. Should it remain there? What is appropriate here? The statue, it turns out, has its own Confederate connections, which are interesting when you dig into the history of this. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm hoping that it will precipitate a discussion in the Miami community about how we evaluate a figure like Washington, who on the one hand, invented the institution of the presidency, an institution which we find eroded and under attack at this very moment. On the other hand, he was a large slave owner. And when he brought his slaves to Philadelphia, which was a free city, he worked very hard to keep them enslaved. And when they escaped, he sent slave catchers after them. In Philadelphia in the 1790s, if you were living in that city for 6 months, you were automatically a free person. So Washington kept his slaves there for 5 months and 29 days and sent them back to Virginia so that they could not sue for their own freedom. So both of these things are true about Washington, and I think that with what the architecture school is doing, I hope we really do have a community conversation about what's worth preserving, what's worth memorializing, and how we do that.
I think that's well said. I'm wondering if anyone on this call might have some opinions. Does anyone want to chime in? And
yeah, let's have some questions.
Yes. Also, it could be a question about how should these monuments be treated now? Should they be taken down? Should they be contextualized by putting them in a museum? Are there other possibilities? I noted, I just saw an announcement that the Mellon Foundation is set aside a large chunk of funding to help institutions brainstorm how to reimagine these monuments. What should be done with these monuments?
Yeah. Because I will say, right, as offensive as they are to me, and Tammy, as you said they are to you and your family, and I would agree with you. There is a history here that is important to remember, right? It is a history of white supremacy. It's a history of the way in which the Civil War has played in our collective memory. And I'm not convinced that simply getting rid of them all is necessarily the best. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know if you have thoughts about that, Tammy, or not. I do worry sometimes that Americans do have a tendency to forget. We're good on a kind of, collective amnesia.
Right.
So
I agree. I think we have a problem with amnesia. And one reason why I bring my own family history into the classroom is to remind students about how recent this history is. For example, I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and my mother, when she graduated from high school, Hughes High School in Cincinnati, she did not have a high school graduation ceremony in 1967. It was 67 or 68 because there were race riots in the city. So there was no graduation. I actually attended my mom's high school graduation ceremony with her 20 years later, and I was 10 years old. And, that's very recent history. My parents, they're alive and well. They're 71, 72. And this is recent history. Yep. So that's one reason I talk about that. So on one hand, I agree, this is a history we need to remember. But I think it's complex because when you think about, again, who writes history, there are so many monuments to white men across the United States. I would like to see more monuments to women in general across the United States. Yeah. I would like to see more monuments for not only African-American activists, intellectuals, artists, accomplished people. I would like to see ways to acknowledge communities and let's say the foot soldiers of freedom struggles that might not have necessarily been in the spotlight, but contributed to the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, etc. I just posted a question in the chat. I said, what monuments would you like to see built throughout the United States? If anyone wants to chime in, I will say, I'll get us started by saying Ida B. Wells, the African-American intellectual journalist who at the turn of the 20th century was very outspoken in terms of speaking out against lynching. That was the attack and murder of usually Black men who were successful businessmen and were successful businessmen in competition with white, let's say, grocery store owners. There was a specific example in which Ida B. Wells' very good friend was lynched, and that motivated her to become an activist. So I would love to see, a monument to her. I see in the chat, Fannie Lou Hamer, that would be wonderful. She was a leading African-American civil rights activist from Mississippi. She's famous for that statement, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. That was the summer of Freedom Summer that we hear so much about at Miami University, 1964, in which students in their 20s were trained by Fannie Lou Hamer and others to go to Mississippi and register Blacks to vote. And again, there are so many sacrifices made. This might already exist, but I would say even a monument to Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. Those were the students who lost their lives. The one African-American young man and two white students who went to Mississippi to register Blacks to vote and were killed by white supremacists. That's a history we should not forget. They should have monuments. Maybe they do have monuments somewhere, but I'm not aware of it.
So I'm going to answer this question in a contrary kind of a way.
Okay, sure.
Because I want to, I want to keep the conversation lively. I don't, I'm not sure. I think the time for monument building is past. I don't think we need to do this anymore, or I don't think we need to do it in the way that we always have, which is the guy on the horse. And even if it's a woman on a horse, I'm not sure that's, here's what I'm thinking about. Some years ago, and again, those of you a little older will remember this, when the competition was held to build the Vietnam War Memorial on the Mall in Washington, it was an enormous controversy when Maya Lin from Athens, Ohio, was selected. And by the way, that was her senior project in a design class. So that's a lot of pressure on you seniors out there. It wasn't representational. What people wanted were statues of soldiers, and maybe statues of soldiers and nurses and stuff, because that's what we think of when we think of memorials and monuments. What she has, of course, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, it's this black granite V cut into the landscape, and it's nothing but the names. There are no images, there are no three-dimensional soldiers. And I guarantee you that for people who go to the mall, it is the single most moving thing they experience. And I wonder if that's the way we need to start thinking about how we memorialize or how we remember moments in American history. I think we need to get away, my own sense is, I think we need to get away from putting somebody up on a horse and a pedestal in the middle of the town square. And we need to think more about those monuments that engage us emotionally in the way that Maya Lin's piece in Washington does. So that's my, my contrary thing to say.
I'm happy you said that. That's really important. And I think you do see a movement towards more types of memorialization of tragedies in that manner. So I just quickly looked up the lynching memorial, which is
right in Alabama,
the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. They take a similar approach, more of an abstract design with the names of people who lost their lives. So I think that's really important. I also like the idea of changing memorials, the idea of, and I was thinking about this walking through my own neighborhood. So I live in College Hill. It's around 15 minutes from downtown Cincinnati. I was walking my dog through my neighborhood yesterday, and I saw a brand new kind of exhibit in a storefront. Anytime I walked past that storefront in the past, it was just an empty window. But now there's an exhibit to activists, current day activists fighting for social justice who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement. But then it goes back historically and features women, men, African American and white activists who were abolitionists and who were part of the Underground Railroad, movement of slaves from slavery to freedom. We know Ohio, Cincinnati, especially crossing over the Ohio River from Kentucky to Cincinnati. It's a major landmark for freedom. So I like that idea of a storefront right in my own neighborhood. And you could tell the way the design was done. They were really kind of high quality cardboard cutouts. You could tell this was a temporary exhibit that then, maybe in a few more months, there'll be another type of exhibit. So I like that idea too.
Yeah.
I'm looking at, we have a lot of comments in the chat. I'm trying to now.
So Taylor, I don't know you, but you're interested in musicians and pioneers of music. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Wait, can everyone hear me?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. At least in my experience, it's rare when I see a monument dedicated to a Black musician, and I think that because a lot of music today is based on what a lot of musicians were doing like way back. I think I just think it's right for us to commemorate them. I mean, we have monuments to Elvis. Elvis, most of his music was based on blues, which was like what a lot of like Black musicians were doing at the time. So I think there's just a little bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah. Nice.
Oh, I must comment, very timely subject because the Zoom call that I attended right before this was on a monument to Miles Davis in his hometown of Alton, Illinois. And so you're right on track. You know, Miles Davis, brilliant jazz musician, was arguably one of the most famous people from Alton, but just it's just now getting a statue. And the artist himself was on the call talking about conceiving the idea and deciding to depict Miles Davis, who's, you know, stylized as a bit of an abstract representation. And he's about the same size as he is in real life. And he's not up on a pedestal, he's actually on the ground. So this is his way of kind of changing the gaze to say, okay, Miles Davis was human. Some controversy and criticism about should a statue be dedicated to him circled around. He had a history with domestic violence and abusing his wives, and he was a drug addict. But as a committee, they decided he was human, he was flawed, and he was a brilliant musician. And as a native son of Alton, they wanted to talk about that history, so they decided to do that. I personally am interested in music. I am close to finishing a biography of Jimi Hendrix, and there is a beautiful monument for Hendrix in his hometown, Seattle, Washington, of him playing the guitar. And there's a memorial in, well, it's not in Seattle proper, it's around 30 minutes outside of Seattle. So you find that fans of Hendrix kind of make pilgrimages there to celebrate his legacy. But I agree with you, more African-American musicians need to be acknowledged, more women in particular need to be acknowledged. I would love to see a monument to, or let's go back to this concept of maybe a changing monument. Let's say even in my own neighborhood, maybe again, I'm one of those people who's all about proactive, you know, change, take action. I'm going to actually inquire about this new exhibit window and say, maybe perhaps I could do a changing exhibit that deals with African-American women in music. So that's something to think about even as a student. What can you do proactively? Is there a space, and now since COVID, we're online, perhaps you could create some type of digital archive that you share with your classmates. Maybe you can create some type of project, you know, that's part of a bigger project that you're doing for class, but it helps create this broader, bigger, more inclusive narrative.
I'm scrolling through some of the questions here, and I wonder, you referenced, Tammy, things going on in South Africa. We have a graduate student from Zimbabwe who has a question here. And so, Paida, do you mind if I call on you, and would you elaborate on your question?
So I was, maybe I should have put a bit more information, given that the South Africa case is a bit different, where we've seen the students, you know, violently, you know, getting rid of some of those monuments. So that was where my question was coming from, that on one hand, I understand, you know, the emotions that are behind it, but obviously this is not a solution. But then in terms of, you know, them being educated, is there anything that could be done to better educate them, or is there a solution to finding a solution?
Yeah, Paida, no, I want to press you a little bit here. So Rhodes Must Fall, and this is, for those that don't know, this is Cecil Rhodes, the big statue of Cecil Rhodes, who was, you know, how to describe him. He was a businessman. He made, you know, a gajillion dollars in the mining industry, but he essentially therefore ran parts of Southern Africa, and, you know, as a kind of personal fiefdom. Before there was a country of Zimbabwe, it was the country of Rhodesia after his name. So I don't know what the Cape Town students, how they reacted. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So they basically took down, I mean, it was quite violent. They were, you know, protests, and unlike here where, you know, students disagree and the statue has been covered, but in South Africa, in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town, I mean, you know, they vandalized the statue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so again, I don't want you to get you into any trouble, but would you have been one of those participating in that, or do you think that that was inappropriate?
I think that was inappropriate. but also I understand the feelings behind it. I mean, I feel their pain yeah, because this all boils down to Cecil Jones Rhodes and, and being part of colonization in Southern Africa. So I feel their pain, but I don't think that was the way, to handle this situation. But unfortunately, South Africa also, when we look at it, because of their, apartheid history, they are, for lack of a better words, there's a lot of violence, and, they've been associated as being a violent nation, and this is how they react or respond when they're not happy about something. But I don't think that is necessarily the right way to respond. But I agree with, how they feel about
Right.
the statue.
Yeah. So right. So wow. There's a lot going on there. Let me just first note that while Tammy and I discussed a moment ago the relationship, the influence that the system of Southern segregation had on South Africa and on Germany in the 1930s. I think one of the fascinating things to me about this moment right now is the extent to which the Black Lives Matter movement has resonated internationally as well. The people in Bristol, England would not have thrown that statue in the river had it not been for what was going on in the United States. And perhaps the students at the University of Cape Town were themselves also kind of inspired by what was going on. I think that just as the civil rights movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s had international resonance, so too, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think you see this popping up all over the place, even in places like Eastern Europe and Russia, where you'd be surprised to find it. So yeah, so this question of what's the right response? Yeah, if I had the answer to that, Tammy, you got thoughts?
I have some strong opinions here. I will say this, I personally have never vandalized a monument or taken one down, but I actually don't have any problem with that when it's done, believe it or not. And I will say this, actually, I do have some expertise in South African history. My undergraduate degree centered on women's political activism in South Africa. I did my research for my thesis. I was there for 2 months in Johannesburg. I've gone back. I've spent some time in Durban, some time in Cape Town. And I will say, South Africa is negatively stereotyped as violent, and I think it gets a bad rap. South Africa is not the only place that has had students vandalize monuments or aggressively take monuments down. That's happened in countless countries. Like literally, we could make an Excel spreadsheet of all the countries that that's happened in. I will say this, given the nature of the struggle against apartheid from 1948 to 1994, and the way in which the Nationalist Party of Afrikaners pitted the Xhosa against the Zulu and ethnic groups and armed them. And think about violence on a number of levels. Apartheid itself did a type of violence to these communities that were forced into the worst land, the 87% of the Black population forced into the smallest areas of the country that were not livable. And given the word substandard or inferior education is not even a correct term. They were educated at Bantustans and just oppressed in a way that you think about cause and effect. It was only a matter of time for things to erupt. So this idea of South African students, I don't really buy the idea of them being more violent than other students across the nation who've opposed oppression through monuments. Let's take, for example, this very famous case. So this is going to bring our conversation full circle, Steve, since you talked about Dylann Roof and the murder. He entered this Black church saying he wanted to pray with these people. It ended up killing 9 Black people, innocent people. And so in South Carolina, the Confederate flag waved outside the state capitol, and a woman named Bree Newsom scaled the pole and took it down. And one thing that's not talked about enough with this story is this. she had a committee of multiracial allies in doing this. She was not the only one who said, we're going to take this flag down. There were actually white activists who said, you know what, it needs to be a Black woman who scales that pole to take this flag down. And the white activists shared their climbing equipment with her. They trained her. And this is where we need to call to action allies to use their white privilege and their white power for good, because there was a white young man who stood with his hand on the pole so that the police officer would not tase the pole and electrocute her as she climbed and came back down. And so this white young man, you know, he's not in the news, he's not celebrated like Bree, who's a Black woman, but his presence was crucial to say, I'm going to stand here as an ally and use my white privilege to keep her safe as we work together to topple these symbols of oppression.
Yeah, that's a great story, which I did not know. I mean, I did know the story about Bree. I didn't know the rest of it. So thank you for that. I'm pulling out something that Harley Wells posted to us, and just to sort of underscore it, I think one of the things that we're discovering now that we are asking all these questions is the extent to which, a particular version of the Civil War and its legacy continues to be woven into the fabric of our national life in all kinds of ways. So Harley here is drawing a contrast between the way plantations are open as museums or destinations across parts of the South, and concentration camps in Europe, which are decidedly not wedding venues or places where you would go to have costume balls the way you can at some of those plantations in the South. And so again, it's part of, so those become monuments themselves to a certain version of Southern history. Tammy and I were talking earlier, you know, it's still kind of remarkable that 10 major US military installations remain named after Confederate generals, given what I started out by saying. These were people who were traitors to the United States and to the United States Army in particular. And yet, and in fact, the two largest Army bases in the country, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Fort Hood, Texas, both named after Confederates. And the president, of course, has insisted that those names are not going to change, even though the military now wants them to change. So, as I said, I think once we can look at flags waving over state capitals, and that's important, but then what it has led to, I think for a lot of people, I hope for a lot of people, is the recognition of just how deeply this has that rooted itself across the culture.
I want to respond to Jordan, our colleague Jordan Fenton's
Jordan.
comment. How much time do we have left, Steve?
Well, we got a little while, as long as people are patient. It's getting dinner time, so.
Okay, Jordan, I want to respond to your comment, and then, feel free to, if you can, log on or unmute yourself to say something. So I think this is a great question about what do we think of museums, and how do we preserve these monuments? Like, what role do museums play? I will say, for many of these monuments, if we choose to put them in museums, I think that is a better way to contextualize them, because in the museum, the design of museums is you go, you read, the background of the item. I prefer more interactive approaches. Like I mentioned to you, my first real job was working at the Minnesota Historical Society. I worked in the education department. I organized public programs. So I like the idea of public programming. If there is a person who is part of this history in particular that has insights on this monument, from opposing views. Perhaps it could be an oral history project that is working side by side with the monument to talk about what the community thinks about it and even controversy surrounding it. So I do think museums are a place to contextualize them. But this is the tricky part. I feel like because, the monuments are overwhelmingly white men, I'll say I'm coming from the perspective of also as an artist. I'm a visual artist. I paint, I draw, I do mixed media work. So I think all monuments are not created equal in terms of artistic execution. So for lack of better phrase, let's just say some random sculptor who had very few skills, according to the committee that decides this sculptor was not very skilled. Like, do we need to preserve that monument? I don't know. I say melt it down if it's not very good. Don't waste museum space is what I'm saying. And let's get some more, kind of acknowledgement again in whatever form it takes, abstract.
Here comes the aesthetic judgments now. Tammy Brown is the arbiter of our taste.
So, Jordan, do you want to comment, or did that answer your question?
Yeah, is my mic on?
Yes, you're on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Stephen, for this wonderful talk. This is great. I mean, ultimately, right, there's many issues, many layers, but community space is about this. And so what's the best venue? What's the best space for these discussions to play out? And it just seems like in many ways, museums could facilitate that role in a meaningful way, as long as they're curated in a helpful way, of course. But those are just my thoughts in terms of this issue, and thank you for your responses. But yes, I completely agree. Not all monuments are created equal and are placed on that high pedestal in terms of high art.
Right.
And for those who don't know, Jordan is a colleague of ours in the art history department. So it's wonderful to have his point of view here. I would also add to this that universities at their foundation are places to educate. They're places where we have discussions that are difficult, and through those discussions, we learn some things we didn't know before. And so it seems to me that that's different than a monument in the town square or in front of a courthouse. If we can't figure out a way to turn this into an educational opportunity of some kind in some fashion, I'm going to be disappointed. I will feel like we have kind of failed in our mission as educators and as a space of inquiry and teaching.
I agree. And that really circles back to the point that the student made, I believe, from Zimbabwe. What role do professors play in educating and contextualizing this? So I think that this conversation is important. Talking to our local communities is important. My dad is actually the founder and pastor of a Christian non-denominational church in Cincinnati, Ohio. He's asked me to create a educational video on the same topic. And I'm going to refer everyone to this video once it's posted.